Chapter 7. The Schoolmaster's Bride. "Who was the first bride who came to this house, Captain Jim?" Anne asked as they sat around the fireplace after supper. "Was she part of the story I've heard was connected with this house?" asked Gilbert. "Somebody told me you could tell it, Captain Jim." "Well, yes, I know it. I reckon I'm the only person living in Four Winds now that can remember the schoolmaster's bride, as she was when she came to the island. She's been dead this 30 year, but she was one of them women you never forget." "Tell us the story," pleaded Anne. "I want to find out all about the women who have lived in this house before me." "Well, there's just been 3. Elizabeth Russell, and Mrs. Ned Russell, and the schoolmaster's bride. Elizabeth Russell was a nice, clever little critter, and Mrs. Ned was a nice woman, too, but they weren't ever like the schoolmaster's bride. The schoolmaster's name was John Selwyn. He came out from the old country to teach school at the Glen when I was a boy of 16. He wasn't much like the usual run of derelicts who used to come out to PEI to teach school in them days. Most of them were clever, drunken critters who taught the children the 3 R's when they were sober and lambasted them when they wasn't. But John Selwyn was a fine, handsome young fella. He boarded at my father's, and he and me were cronies, though he was 10 years older'n me. We read and walked and talked a heap together. He knew about all the poetry that was ever written, I reckon, and he used to quote it to me along the shore in the evenings. Dad thought it an awful waste of time, but he sorter endured it, hoping it'd put me off the notion of going to sea. Well, nothing could do that. Mother came of a race of sea-going folk, and it was born in me. But I loved to hear John read and recite. It's almost 60 years ago, but I could repeat yards of poetry I learned from him. Nearly 60 years. Captain Jim was silent for a space, gazing into the glowing fire in a quest of the bygones. Then, with a sigh, he resumed his story. "I remember one spring evening I met him on the sandhills. He looked sort of uplifted, just like you did, Dr. Blythe, when you brought Mistress Blythe in tonight. I thought of him the minute I seen you, and he told me that he had a sweetheart back home and that she was coming out to him. I wasn't more'n half pleased, ornery young lump of selfishness that I was. I thought he wouldn't be as much my friend after she came. But I'd decency enough not to let him see it. He told me all about her. Her name was Persis Lee, and she would have come out with him if it hadn't been for her old uncle. He was sick, and he'd looked after her when her parents died and she wouldn't leave him. And now he was dead, and she was coming out to marry John Selwyn. 'Twasn't no easy journey for a woman in them days. There weren't no steamers, you must recollect. 'When d'ye expect her?' says I. 'She sails on the Royal William the 20th of June,' says he, 'and so she should be here by mid-July. I must set Carpenter Johnson to building me a home for her. Her letter came today. I knew before I opened it that it had good news for me. I saw her a few nights ago.' I didn't understand him, and then he explained, though I didn't understand that much better. He said he had a gift or a curse. Them was his words, Mistress Blythe, a gift or a curse. He didn't know which it was. He said a great-great-grandmother of his had it, and they burned her for a witch on account of it. He said queer spells, trances, I think was the name he give 'em, come over him now and again. Are there such things, Doctor?" "There are people who are certainly subject to trances," answered Gilbert. "The matter is more in the line of psychical research than medical. What were the trances of this John Selwyn like?" "Like dreams," said the old doctor skeptically. "He said he could see things in them," said Captain Jim slowly. "Mind you, I'm telling you just what he said, things that were happening, things that were going to happen. He said they were sometimes a comfort to him and sometimes a horror. 4 nights before this he'd been in one, went into it while he was sitting looking at the fire, and he saw an old room he knew well in England, and Persis Lee in it, holding out her hands to him and looking glad and happy, so he knew he was going to hear good news of her." A dream," scoffed the old doctor. Likely, conceded Captain Jim. "That's what I said to him at the time. It was a vast more comfortable to think so. I didn't like the idea of him seeing things like that. It was real uncanny. 'Nope,' says he, 'I didn't dream it. But we won't talk of this again. You won't be so much my friend if you think much about it.' I told him nothing could make me any less his friend. But he just shook his head and says he, 'Lad, I know. I've lost friends before because of this. I don't blame 'em. There are times when I feel hardly friendly to myself because of it. Such a power has a bit of divinity in it, whether of a good or an evil divinity, who shall say? And we mortals all shrink from too close contact with God or devil. Them was his words. I remember them as if 'twas yesterday, though I didn't know just what he meant. What do you suppose he did mean, Doctor?" "I doubt if he knew what he meant himself," said Dr. Dave testily. "I think I understand," whispered Anne. She was listening in her old attitude of clasped lips and shining eyes. Captain Jim treated himself to an admiring smile before he went on with his story. "Well, pretty soon all the Glen and Four Winds people knew the schoolmaster's bride was coming, and they were all glad because they thought so much of him. And everybody took an interest in his new house, this house. He picked this site for it because you could see the harbor and hear the sea from it. He made the garden out there for his bride, but he didn't plant the Lombardies. Mrs. Ned Russell planted them. But there's a double row of rose bushes in the garden that the little girls who went to the Glen school set out there for the schoolmaster's bride. He said they were pink for her cheeks, and white for her brow, and red for her lips. He'd quoted poetry so much that he sort of got into the habit of talking it, too, I reckon. Almost everybody sent him some little present to help out the furnishing of the house. When the Russells came into it, they were well-to-do and furnished it real handsome, as you can see. But the first furniture that went into it was plain enough. This little house was rich in love, though. The women sent in quilts and tablecloths and towels, and one man made a chest for her, and another a table, and so on. Even blind old Aunt Margaret Boyd wove a little basket for her out of the sweet-scented sandhill grass. The schoolmaster's wife used it for years to keep her handkerchiefs in. Well, at last everything was ready, even to the logs in the big fireplace ready for lighting. 'Twasn't exactly this fireplace, though 'twas in the same place. Miss Elizabeth had this put in when she made the house over 15 years ago. It was a big, old-fashioned fireplace where you could have roasted an ox. Many's the time I've sat here and spun yarns, same's I'm doing tonight." Again there was a silence while Captain Jim kept a passing tryst with visitants Anne and Gilbert could not see, the folks who had sat with him around that fireplace in the vanished years, with mirth and bridal joy shining in eyes long since closed forever under churchyard sod or heaving leagues of sea. Here on olden nights children had tossed laughter lightly to and fro. Here on winter evenings friends had gathered. Dance and music and jest had been here. Here youths and maidens had dreamed. For Captain Jim the little house was tenanted with shapes entreating remembrance. It was the 1st of July when the house was finished. The schoolmaster began to count the days then. We used to see him walking along the shore, and we'd say to each other, "She'll soon be with him now." She was expected the middle of July, but she didn't come then. Nobody felt anxious. Vessels were often delayed for days and maybe weeks. The Royal William was a week overdue, and then 2, and then 3, and at last we began to be frightened, and it got worse and worse. Finally I couldn't bear to look into John Selwyn's eyes. "D'you know, Mistress Blythe," Captain Jim lowered his voice, "I used to think that they looked just like what his old great-great-grandmothers must have been when they were burning her to death. He never said much, but he taught school like a man in a dream, and then hurried to the shore. Many a night he walked there from dark to dawn. People said he was losing his mind. Everybody had given up hope. The Royal William was 8 weeks overdue. It was the middle of September, and the schoolmaster's bride hadn't come. Never would come, we thought. There was a big storm then that lasted 3 days, and on the evening after it died away I went to the shore. I found the schoolmaster there, leaning with his arms folded against a big rock, gazing out to sea. I spoke to him, but he didn't answer. His eyes seemed to be looking at something I couldn't see. His face was set like a dead man's. "John, John," I called out, just like that, just like a frightened child. "Wake up, wake up." That strange, awful look seemed to sort of fade out of his eyes. He turned his head and looked at me. I have never forgot his face, never will forget it till I ships for my last voyage. "All is well, lad," he says. "I've seen the Royal William coming around East Point. She'll be here by dawn. Tomorrow night I shall sit with my bride by my own hearth fire." "Do you think he did see it?" demanded Captain Jim abruptly. "God knows," said Gilbert softly. "Great love and great pain might compass we know not what marvels." "I am sure he did see it," said Anne earnestly. "Folderol," said Dr. Dave, but he spoke with less conviction than usual. "Because you know," said Captain Jim solemnly, "the Royal William came into Four Winds Harbor at daylight the next morning. Every soul in the glen and along the shore was at the old wharf to meet her. The schoolmaster had been watching there all night. How we cheered as she sailed up the channel." Captain Jim's eyes were shining. They were looking at the Four Winds Harbor of 60 years agone, with a battered old ship sailing through the sunrise splendor. "And Persis Leigh was on board?" asked Anne. "Yes, her and the captain's wife. They'd had an awful passage, storm after storm, and their provisions give out, too. But there they were at last. When Persis Leigh stepped onto the old wharf, John Selwyn took her in his arms, and folks stopped cheering and begun to cry. I cried myself, though 'twas years, mind you, afore I'd admit it. Ain't it funny how ashamed boys are of tears?" "Was Persis Leigh beautiful?" asked Anne. "Well, I don't know that you'd call her beautiful exactly. I don't know," said Captain Jim slowly. "Somehow you never got so far along as to wonder if she was handsome or not. It just didn't matter. There was something so sweet and winsome about her that you had to love her. That was all. But she was pleasant to look at. Big, clear, hazel eyes and heaps of glossy brown hair and an English skin. John and her were married at our house that night at early candle lighting. Everybody from far and near was there to see it, and we all brought them down here afterwards. Mistress Selwyn lighted the fire, and we went away and left them sitting here, just as John had seen in that vision of his. A strange thing, a strange thing. But I've seen a terrible lot of strange things in my time." Captain Jim shook his head sagely. "It's a dear story," said Anne, feeling that for once she had got enough romance to satisfy her. "How long did they live here?" 15 years. I ran off to sea soon after they were married, like the young scalawag I was. But every time I come back from a voyage I'd head for here, even before I went home, and tell Mistress Selwyn all about it. 15 happy years. They had a sort of talent for happiness, them two. Some folks are like that, if you've noticed. They couldn't be unhappy for long, no matter what happened. They quarreled once or twice, for they was both high-spirited. But Mistress Selwyn says to me once, says she, laughing in that pretty way of hers, 'I felt dreadful when John and I quarreled, but underneath it all I was very happy because I had such a nice husband to quarrel with and make it up with.' Then they moved to Charlottetown, and Ned Russell bought this house and brought his bride here. They were a gay young pair as I remember them. Miss Elizabeth Russell was Alec's sister. She came to live with them a year or so later, and she was a creature of mirth, too. The walls of this house must be sort of soaked with laughing and good times. You're the third bride I've seen come here, Mistress Blythe, and the handsomest." Captain Jim contrived to give his sunflower compliment the delicacy of a violet, and Anne wore it proudly. She was looking her best that night, with the bridal rose on her cheeks and the love light in her eyes. Even gruff old Dr. Dave gave her an approving glance, and told his wife, as they drove home together, that red-headed wife of the boys was something of a beauty. "I must be getting back to the light," announced Captain Jim. "I've enjoyed this evening something tremendous." "You must come often to see us," said Anne. "I wonder if you'd give that invitation if you knew how likely I'll be to accept it," Captain Jim remarked whimsically. "Which is another way of saying you wonder if I mean it," smiled Anne. "I do. Cross my heart, as we used to say at school." "Then I'll come. You're likely to be pestered with me at any hour, and I'll be proud to have you drop down and visit me now and then, too. Generally I haven't anyone to talk to but the first mate, bless his sociable heart. He's a mighty good listener, and has forgot more'n any McAllister of them all ever knew. But he isn't much of a conversationalist. You're young and I'm old, but our souls are about the same age, I reckon. We both belong to the race that knows Joseph, as Cornelia Bryant would say." "The race that knows Joseph?" puzzled Anne. "Yes, Cornelia divides all the folks in the world into two kinds, the race that knows Joseph and the race that don't. If a person sort of sees eye to eye with you and has pretty much the same ideas about things and the same taste in jokes, why, then he belongs to the race that knows Joseph." "Oh, I understand," exclaimed Anne, light breaking in upon her. "It's what I used to call, and still call in quotation marks, kindred spirits." Just so, agreed Captain Jim. We're it, whatever it is. When you come in tonight, Mistress Blythe, I says to myself, says I, yes, she's of the race that knows Joseph. And mighty glad I was, for if it wasn't so we couldn't have had any real satisfaction in each other's company. The race that knows Joseph is the salt of the earth, I reckon. The moon had just risen when Anne and Gilbert went to the door with their guests. Four Winds Harbor was beginning to be a thing of dream and glamour and enchantment, a spellbound haven where no tempest might ever raven. The Lombardys down the lane, tall and somber as the priestly forms of some mystic band, were tipped with silver. "Always liked Lombardys," said Captain Jim, waving a long arm at them. "They're the trees of princesses. They're out of fashion now. Folks complain that they die at the top and get ragged looking. So they do, if you don't risk your neck every spring climbing up a light ladder to trim them out. I always did it for Miss Elizabeth, so her Lombardys never got out at elbows. She was especially fond of them. She liked their dignity and standoffishness. They don't hobnob with every Tom, Dick, and Harry. If it's maples for company, Mistress Blythe, it's Lombardys for society." "What a beautiful night," said Mrs. Dr. Dave as she climbed into the doctor's buggy. "Most nights are beautiful," said Captain Jim, "but I 'low that moonlight over Four Winds makes me sort o' wonder what's left for heaven. The moon's a great friend of mine, Mistress Blythe. I've loved her ever since I can remember. When I was a little chap of 8 I fell asleep in the garden one evening and wasn't missed. I woke up along in the night and I was most scared to death. What shadows and queer noises there was. I dursn't move. Just crouched there quaking, poor small mite. Seemed as if there weren't anyone in the world but myself, and it was mighty big. Then all at once I saw the moon looking down at me through the apple boughs, just like an old friend. I was comforted right off. Got up and walked to the house as brave as a lion, looking at her. Many's the night I've watched her from the deck of my vessel on seas far away from here. Why don't you folks tell me to take in the slack of my jaw and go home?" The laughter of the good nights died away. Anne and Gilbert walked hand in hand around their garden. The brook that ran across the corner dimpled pellucidly in the shadows of the birches. The poppies along its banks were like shallow cups of moonlight. Flowers that had been planted by the hands of the schoolmaster's bride flung their sweetness on the shadowy air, like the beauty and blessing of sacred yesterdays. Anne paused in the gloom to gather a spray. "I love to smell flowers in the dark," she said. "You get hold of their soul then. Oh, Gilbert, this little house is all I've dreamed it, and I'm so glad that we are not the first to have kept bridal tryst here." Chapter 8. Miss Cornelia Bryant Comes to Call. That month of September was a month of golden mists and purple hazes at Four Winds Harbor, a month of sun-steeped days and of nights that were swimming in moonlight or pulsating with stars. No storm marred it, no rough wind blew. Anne and Gilbert put their nest in order, rambled on the shores, sailed on the harbor, drove about Four Winds and the Glen, or through the ferny, sequestered roads of the woods around the harbor head. In short, had such a honeymoon as any lovers in the world might have envied them. "If life were to stop short just now, it would still have been richly worthwhile, just for the sake of these past 4 weeks, wouldn't it?" said Anne. "I don't suppose we will ever have 4 such perfect weeks again, but we've had them. Everything, wind, weather, folks, House of Dreams, has conspired to make our honeymoon delightful. There hasn't even been a rainy day since we came here." "And we haven't quarreled once," teased Gilbert. "Well, that's a pleasure all the greater for being deferred," quoted Anne. "I'm so glad we decided to spend our honeymoon here. Our memories of it will always belong here, in our House of Dreams, instead of being scattered about in strange places." There was a certain tang of romance and adventure in the atmosphere of their new home, which Anne had never found in Avonlea. There, although she had lived in sight of the sea, it had not entered intimately into her life. In Four Winds it surrounded her and called to her constantly. From every window of her new home she saw some varying aspect of it. Its haunting murmur was ever in her ears. Vessels sailed up the harbor every day to the wharf at the Glen, or sailed out again through the sunset, bound for ports that might be halfway around the globe. Fishing boats went white-winged down the channel in the mornings and returned laden in the evenings. Sailors and fisher folk traveled the red, winding harbor roads, light-hearted and content. There was always a certain sense of things going to happen, of adventures and farings forth. The ways of Four Winds were less staid and settled and grooved than those of Avonlea. Winds of change blew over them, the sea called ever to the dwellers on shore, and even those who might not answer its call felt the thrill and unrest and mystery and possibilities of it. "I understand now why some men must go to sea," said Anne. "That desire which comes to us all at times, to sail beyond the bourne of sunset, must be very imperious when it is born in you. I don't wonder Captain Jim ran away because of it. I never see a ship sailing out of the Channel or a gull soaring over the sandbar without wishing I were on board the ship or had wings, not like a dove to fly away and be at rest, but like a gull to sweep out into the very heart of a storm." "You'll stay right here with me, Anne girl," said Gilbert lazily. "I won't have you flying away from me into the hearts of storms." They were sitting on their red sandstone doorstep in the late afternoon. Great tranquillities were all about them in land and sea and sky. Silvery gulls were soaring over them. The horizons were laced with long trails of frail, pinkish clouds. The hushed air was threaded with a murmurous refrain of minstrel winds and waves. Pale asters were blowing in the sere and misty meadows between them and the harbor. "Doctors who have to be up all night waiting on sick folk don't feel very adventurous, I suppose," Anne said indulgently. "If you had had a good sleep last night, Gilbert, you'd be as ready as I am for a flight of imagination." "I did good work last night, Anne," said Gilbert quietly. "Under God, I saved a life. This is the first time I could ever really claim that. In other cases I may have helped, but Anne, if I had not stayed at Allenby's last night and fought death hand to hand, that woman would have died before morning. I tried an experiment that was certainly never tried in Four Winds before. I doubt if it was ever tried anywhere before outside of a hospital. It was a new thing in Kingsport Hospital last winter. I could never have dared try it here if I had not been absolutely certain that there was no other chance. I risked it, and it succeeded. As a result, a good wife and mother is saved for long years of happiness and usefulness. As I drove home this morning while the sun was rising over the harbor, I thanked God that I had chosen the profession I did. I had fought a good fight and won. Think of it, Anne. Won against the great destroyer. It's what I dreamed of doing long ago when we talked together of what we wanted to do in life. That dream of mine came true this morning." "Was that the only one of your dreams that has come true?" asked Anne, who knew perfectly well what the substance of his answer would be, but wanted to hear it again. "You know, Anne girl," said Gilbert, smiling into her eyes. At that moment there were certainly two perfectly happy people sitting on the doorstep of a little white house on the Four Winds harbor shore. Presently Gilbert said with a change of tone, "Do I or do I not see a full-rigged ship sailing up our lane?" Anne looked and sprang up. "That must be either Miss Cornelia Bryant or Mrs. Moore coming to call," she said. "I'm going into the office, and if it is Miss Cornelia, I warn you that I'll eavesdrop," said Gilbert. "From all I've heard regarding Miss Cornelia, I conclude that her conversation will not be dull, to say the least." "It may be Mrs. Moore." "I don't think Mrs. Moore is built on those lines. I saw her working in her garden the other day, and though I was too far away to see clearly, I thought she was rather slender. She doesn't seem very socially inclined when she has never called on you yet, although she's your nearest neighbor." "She can't be like Mrs. Lynde after all, or curiosity would have brought her," said Anne. "This caller is, I think, Miss Cornelia." Miss Cornelia it was. Moreover, Miss Cornelia had not come to make any brief and fashionable wedding call. She had her work under her arm and a substantial parcel, and when Anne asked her to stay, she promptly took off her capacious sun hat, which had been held on her head, despite irreverent September breezes, by a tight elastic band under her hard little knob of fair hair. No hat pins for Miss Cornelia, an it please you. Elastic bands had been good enough for her mother, and they were good enough for her. She had a fresh, round, pink and white face and jolly brown eyes. She did not look in the least like the traditional old maid, and there was something in her expression which won Anne instantly. With her old instinctive quickness to discern kindred spirits, she knew she was going to like Miss Cornelia, in spite of uncertain oddities of opinion and certain oddities of attire. Nobody but Miss Cornelia would have come to make a call, arrayed in a striped blue and white apron and a wrapper of chocolate print, with a design of huge pink roses scattered over it. And nobody but Miss Cornelia could have looked dignified and suitably garbed in it. Had Miss Cornelia been entering a palace to call on a prince's bride, she would have been just as dignified and just as wholly mistress of the situation. She would have trailed her rose-spattered flounce over the marble floors just as unconcernedly, and she would have proceeded just as calmly to disabuse the mind of the princess of any idea that the possession of a mere man, be he prince or peasant, was anything to brag of. "I've brought my work, Mrs. Blythe, dearie," she remarked, unrolling some dainty material. "I'm in a hurry to get this done, and there isn't any time to lose." Anne looked in some surprise at the white garment spread over Miss Cornelia's ample lap. It was certainly a baby's dress, and it was most beautifully made, with tiny frills and tucks. Miss Cornelia adjusted her glasses and fell to embroidering with exquisite stitches. "This is for Mrs. Fred Proctor up at the Glen," she announced. "She's expecting her 8th baby any day now, and not a stitch has she ready for it. The other 7 have wore out all she made for the first, and she's never had time or strength or spirit to make any more. That woman is a martyr, Mrs. Blythe, believe me. When she married Fred Proctor, I knew how it would turn out. He was one of your wicked, fascinating men. After he got married, he left off being fascinating and just kept on being wicked. He drinks and he neglects his family. Isn't that like a man? I don't know how Mrs. Proctor would ever keep her children decently clothed if her neighbors didn't help her out." As Anne was afterwards to learn, Miss Cornelia was the only neighbor who troubled herself much about the decency of the young Proctors. "When I heard this 8th baby was coming, I decided to make some things for it," Miss Cornelia went on. "This is the last, and I want to finish it today." "It's certainly very pretty," said Anne. "I'll get my sewing, and we'll have a little thimble party of 2. You're a beautiful sewer, Miss Bryant." "Yes, I'm the best sewer in these parts," said Miss Cornelia in a matter-of-fact tone. "I ought to be. Lord, I've done more of it than if I'd had 100 children of my own, believe me. I suppose I'm a fool to be putting hand embroidery on this dress for an 8th baby. But Lord, Mrs. Blythe, dearie, it isn't to blame for being the 8th. And I kind of wished it to have one real pretty dress, just as if it was wanted. Nobody's wanting the poor mite, so I put some extra fuss on its little things just on that account." "Any baby might be proud of that dress," said Anne, feeling still more strongly that she was going to like Miss Cornelia. "I suppose you've been thinking I was never coming to call on you," resumed Miss Cornelia. "But this is the harvest month, you know, and I've been busy, and a lot of extra hands hanging around eating more than they work, just like the men. I'd have come yesterday, but I went to Mrs. Roderick McAllister's funeral. At first I thought my head was aching so badly I couldn't enjoy myself if I did go. But she was 100 years old, and I'd always promised myself that I'd go to her funeral." "Was it a successful function?" asked Anne, noticing that the office door was ajar. "What's that? Oh, yes, it was a tremendous funeral. She had a very large connection. There was over 120 carriages in the procession. There was 1 or 2 funny things happened. I thought that die I would to see old Jaw Bradshaw, who is an infidel and never darkens the door of a church, singing 'Safe in the Arms of Jesus' with great gusto and fervor. He glories in singing. That's why he never misses a funeral. Poor Mrs. Bradshaw didn't look much like singing, all wore out slaving. Old Joe starts out once in a while to buy her a present and brings home some new kind of farm machinery. Isn't that like a man? But what else would you expect of a man who never goes to church, even a Methodist one? I was real thankful to see you and the young doctor in the Presbyterian church your first Sunday. No doctor for me who wasn't a Presbyterian." "We were in the Methodist church last Sunday evening," said Anne wickedly. "Oh, I suppose Dr. Blythe has to go to the Methodist church once in a while, or he wouldn't get the Methodist practice." "We liked the sermon very much," declared Anne boldly, "and I thought the Methodist minister's prayer was one of the most beautiful I ever heard." "Oh, I've no doubt he can pray. I never heard anyone make more beautiful prayers than old Simon Bentley, who was always drunk, or hoping to be, and the drunker he was, the better he prayed." "The Methodist minister is very fine looking," said Anne, for the benefit of the office door. "Yes, he's quite ornamental," agreed Miss Cornelia. "Oh, and very ladylike. And he thinks that every girl who looks at him falls in love with him, as if a Methodist minister wandering about like any Jew was such a prize. If you and the young doctor take my advice, you won't have much to do with the Methodists. My motto is, if you are a Presbyterian, be a Presbyterian." "Don't you think that Methodists go to heaven as well as Presbyterians?" asked Anne smilelessly. "That isn't for us to decide. It's in higher hands than ours," said Miss Cornelia solemnly. "But I ain't going to associate with them on earth, whatever I may have to do in heaven. This Methodist minister isn't married. The last one they had was, and his wife was the silliest, flightiest little thing I ever saw. I told her husband once that he should have waited till she was grown up before he married her. He said he wanted to have the training of her. Wasn't that like a man?" "It's rather hard to decide just when people are grown up," laughed Anne. "That's a true word, dearie. Some are grown up when they're born, and others ain't grown up when they're 80, believe me. That same Mrs. Roderick I was speaking of never grew up. She was as foolish when she was 100 as she was when she was 10.
"Perhaps that was why she lived so long," suggested Anne.
"Maybe 'twas. I'd rather live 50 sensible years than 100 foolish ones."
"But just think what a dull world it would be if everyone was sensible," pleaded Anne.
Miss Cornelia disdained any skirmish of flippant epigram. "Mrs. Roderick was a Milgrave, and the Milgraves never had much sense. Her nephew, Ebenezer Milgrave, used to be insane for years. He believed he was dead and used to rage at his wife because she wouldn't bury him. I'd 'a' done it." Miss Cornelia looked so grimly determined that Anne could almost see her with a spade in her hand.
"Don't you know any good husbands, Miss Bryant?"
"Oh, yes, lots of them over yonder," said Miss Cornelia, waving her hand through the open window towards the little graveyard of the church across the harbor.
"But living, going about in the flesh?" persisted Anne.
"Oh, there's a few, just to show that with God all things are possible," acknowledged Miss Cornelia reluctantly. "I don't deny that an odd man here and there, if he's caught young and trained up proper, and if his mother has spanked him well beforehand, may turn out a decent being. Your husband, now, isn't so bad, as men go, from all I hear. I suppose," Miss Cornelia looked sharply at Anne over her glasses, "you think there's nobody like him in the world."
"There isn't," said Anne promptly.
"Ah, well, I heard another bride say that once," sighed Miss Cornelia. "Jenny Dean thought when she married that there wasn't anybody like her husband in the world, and she was right. There wasn't, and a good thing too, believe me. He led her an awful life, and he was courting his second wife while Jenny was dying. Wasn't that like a man? However, I hope your confidence will be better justified, dearie. The young doctor is taking real well. I was afraid at first he mightn't, for folks hereabouts have always thought old Dr. Dave the only doctor in the world. Dr. Dave hadn't much tact, to be sure. He was always talking of ropes and houses where someone had hanged himself, but folks forgot their hurt feelings when they had a pain in their stomachs. If he'd been a minister instead of a doctor, they'd never have forgiven him. Soul ache doesn't worry folks near as much as stomach ache. Seeing as we're both Presbyterians and no Methodists around, will you tell me your candid opinion of our minister?"
"Well, really, well,"
hesitated Anne. Miss Cornelia nodded. "Exactly. I agree with you, dearie. We made a mistake when we called him. His face just looks like one of those long, narrow stones in the graveyard, doesn't it? Sacred to the memory ought to be written on his forehead. I shall never forget the first sermon he preached after he came. It was on the subject of everyone doing what they were best fitted for. A very good subject, of course, but such illustrations as he used. He said, if you had a cow and an apple tree, and if you tied the apple tree in your stable and planted the cow in your orchard with her legs up, how much milk would you get from the apple tree, or how many apples from the cow? Did you ever hear the like in your born days, dearie? I was so thankful there were no Methodists there that day. They'd never have been done hooting over it. But what I dislike most in him is his habit of agreeing with everybody, no matter what is said. If you said to him, 'You're a scoundrel,' he'd say with that smooth smile of his, 'Yes, that's so.' A minister should have more backbone. The long and the short of it is, I consider him a reverend jackass. But, of course, this is just between you and me. When there are Methodists in hearing, I praise him to the skies. Some folks think his wife dresses too gay, but I say when she has to live with a face like that, she needs something to cheer her up. You'll never hear me condemning a woman for her dress. I'm only too thankful when her husband isn't too mean and miserly to allow it. Not that I bother much with dress myself. Women just dress to please the men, and I'd never stoop to that. I've had a real placid, comfortable life, dearie, and it's just because I never cared a cent what the men thought." Why do you hate the men so, Miss Bryant?" "Lord, dearie, I don't hate them. They aren't worth it. I just sort of despise them. I think I'll like your husband if he keeps on as he has begun. But apart from him, about the only men in the world I've much use for are the old doctor and Captain Jim." "Captain Jim is certainly splendid," agreed Anne cordially. "Captain Jim is a good man, but he's kind of vexing in one way. You can't make him mad. I've tried for 20 years and he just keeps on being placid. It does sort of rile me. And I suppose the woman he should have married got a man who went into tantrums twice a day." "Who was she?" "Oh, I don't know, dearie. I never remember of Captain Jim making up to anybody. He was edging on old as far as my memory goes. He's 76, you know. I never heard any reason for his staying a bachelor, but there must be one, believe me. He sailed all his life till 5 years ago, and there's no corner of the earth he hasn't poked his nose into. He and Elizabeth Russell were great cronies all their lives, but they never had any notion of sweethearting. Elizabeth never married, though she had plenty of chances. She was a great beauty when she was young. The year the Prince of Wales came to the island she was visiting her uncle in Charlottetown, and he was a government official, and so she got invited to the great ball. She was the prettiest girl there, and the prince danced with her, and all the other women he didn't dance with were furious about it, because their social standing was higher than hers, and they said he shouldn't have passed them over. Elizabeth was always very proud of that dance. Mean folks said that was why she never married. She couldn't put up with an ordinary man after dancing with a prince. But that wasn't so. She told me the reason once. It was because she had such a temper that she was afraid she couldn't live peaceably with any man. She had an awful temper. She used to have to go upstairs and bite pieces out of her bureau to keep it down by times. But I told her that wasn't any reason for not marrying if she wanted to. There's no reason why we should let the men have a monopoly of temper, is there, Mrs. Blythe, dearie?" "I've a bit of a temper myself," sighed Anne. "It's well you have, dearie. You won't be half so likely to be trodden on, believe me. My, how that golden glow of yours is blooming. Your garden looks fine. Poor Elizabeth always took such care of it." "I love it," said Anne. "I'm glad it's so full of old-fashioned flowers. Speaking of gardening, we want to get a man to dig up that little lot beyond the fir grove and set it out with strawberry plants for us. Gilbert is so busy he will never get the time for it this fall. Do you know anyone we can get?" "Well, Henry Hammond up at the Glen goes out doing jobs like that. He'll do, maybe. He's always a heap more interested in his wages than in his work, just like a man, and he's so slow in the uptake that he stands still for 5 minutes before it dawns on him that he stopped. His father threw a stump at him when he was small. Nice gentle missile, wasn't it? So like a man. Course the boy never got over it. But he's the only one I can recommend at all. He painted my house for me last spring. It looks real nice now, don't you think?" Anne was saved by the clock striking 5. "Good Lord, is it that late?" exclaimed Miss Cornelia. "How time does slip by when you're enjoying yourself. Well, I must betake myself home." "No, indeed. You're going to stay and have tea with us," said Anne eagerly. "Are you asking me because you think you ought to, or because you really want to?" demanded Miss Cornelia. "Because I really want to." "Then I'll stay. You belong to the race that knows Joseph." "I know we're going to be friends," said Anne with the smile that only they of the household of faith ever saw. "Yes, we are, dearie. Thank goodness we can choose our friends. We have to take our relatives as they are and be thankful if there are no penitentiary birds among them. Not that I've many, none nearer than second cousins. I'm kind of a lonely soul, Mrs. Blythe." There was a wistful note in Miss Cornelia's voice. "I wish you would call me Anne," exclaimed Anne impulsively. "It would seem more homey. Everyone in Four Winds except my husband calls me Mrs. Blythe, and it makes me feel like a stranger. Do you know that your name is very near being the one I yearned after when I was a child? I hated Anne, and I called myself Cordelia in imagination." "I like Anne. It was my mother's name. Old-fashioned names are the best and sweetest, in my opinion. If you're going to get tea, you might send the young doctor to talk to me. He's been lying on the sofa in that office ever since I came, laughing fit to kill over what I've been saying." "How did you know?" cried Anne, too aghast at this instance of Miss Cornelia's uncanny prescience to make a polite denial. "I saw him sitting beside you when I came up the lane, and I know men's tricks," retorted Miss Cornelia. "There, I've finished my little dress, dearie, and the 8th baby can come as soon as it pleases." Chapter 9. An Evening at Four Winds Point. It was late September when Anne and Gilbert were able to pay Four Winds Light their promised visit. They had often planned to go, but something always occurred to prevent them. Captain Jim had dropped in several times at the little house. "I don't stand on ceremony, Mistress Blythe," he told Anne. "It's a real pleasure to me to come here, and I'm not going to deny myself just because you haven't got down to see me. There oughtn't to be no bargaining like that among the race that knows Joseph. I'll come when I can, and you come when you can, and so long's we have our pleasant little chat, it don't matter a mite what roof's over us." Captain Jim took a great fancy to Gog and Magog, who were presiding over the destinies of the hearth in the little house with as much dignity and aplomb as they had done at Patty's Place. "Aren't they the cutest little cusses?" he would say delightedly, and he bade them greeting and farewell as gravely and invariably as he did his host and hostess. Captain Jim was not going to offend household deities by any lack of reverence and ceremony. "You've made this little house just about perfect," he told Anne. "It never was so nice before. Mistress Selwyn had your taste and she did wonders, but folks in those days didn't have the pretty little curtains and pictures and knickknacks you have. As for Elizabeth, she lived in the past. You've kind of brought the future into it, so to speak. I'd be real happy even if we couldn't talk at all when I come here. Just to sit and look at you and your pictures and your flowers would be enough of a treat. It's beautiful, beautiful." Captain Jim was a passionate worshipper of beauty. Every lovely thing heard or seen gave him a deep, subtle inner joy that irradiated his life. He was quite keenly aware of his own lack of outward comeliness, and lamented it. "Folks say I'm good," he remarked whimsically upon one occasion, "but I sometimes wish the Lord had made me only half as good and put the rest of it into looks. But there, I reckon he knew what he was about, as a good captain should. Some of us have to be homely, or the purty ones, like Mistress Blythe here, wouldn't show up so well." One evening Anne and Gilbert finally walked down to the Four Winds Light. The day had begun somberly in gray cloud and mist, but it had ended in a pomp of scarlet and gold. Over the western hills beyond the harbor were amber deeps and crystalline shadows, with the fire of sunset below. The north was a mackerel sky of little fiery golden clouds. The red light flamed on the white sails of a vessel gliding down the channel, bound to a southern port in a land of palms. Beyond her it smote upon and incarnadined the shining, white, grassless faces of the sand dunes. To the right it fell on the old house among the willows up the brook, and gave it for a fleeting space casements more splendid than those of an old cathedral. They glowed out of its quiet and grayness like the throbbing, blood-red thoughts of a vivid soul imprisoned in a dull husk of environment. "That old house up the brook always seems so lonely," said Anne. "I never see visitors there. Of course, its lane opens on the upper road, but I don't think there's much coming and going. It seems odd we've never met the Moores yet, when they live within 15 minutes' walk of us. I may have seen them in church, of course, but if so, I didn't know them. I'm sorry they're so unsociable when there are only near neighbors." "Evidently they don't belong to the race that knows Joseph," laughed Gilbert. "Have you ever found out who that girl was whom you thought so beautiful?" "No. Somehow I have never remembered to ask about her, but I've never seen her anywhere, so I suppose she must have been a stranger. Oh, the sun has just vanished, and there's the light." As the dusk deepened, the great beacon cut swathes of light through it, sweeping in a circle over the fields and the harbor, the sandbar and the gulf. "I feel as if it might catch me and whisk me leagues out to sea," said Anne, as one drenched them with radiance, and she felt rather relieved when they got so near the point that they were inside the range of those dazzling recurrent flashes. As they turned into the little lane that led across the fields to the point, they met a man coming out of it, a man of such extraordinary appearance that for a moment they both frankly stared. He was a decidedly fine-looking person, tall, broad-shouldered, well-featured, with a Roman nose and frank gray eyes. He was dressed in a prosperous farmer's Sunday best. In so far, he might have been any inhabitant of Four Winds or the Glen. But flowing over his breast, nearly to his knees, was a river of crinkly brown beard, and adown his back, beneath his commonplace felt hat, was a corresponding cascade of thick, wavy brown hair. "Anne," murmured Gilbert when they were out of earshot, "you didn't put what Uncle Dave calls a little of the Scott act in that lemonade you gave me just before we left home, did you?" "No, I didn't," said Anne, stifling her laughter, lest the retreating enigma should hear her. "Who in the world can he be?" "I don't know. But if Captain Jim keeps apparitions like that down at this Point, I'm going to carry cold iron in my pocket when I come here. He wasn't a sailor, or one might pardon his eccentricity of appearance. He must belong to the over harbor clans. Uncle Dave says they have several freaks over there."
Uncle Dave is a little prejudiced, I think. You know all the over harbor people who come to the Glen church seem very nice. Oh, Gilbert, isn't this beautiful?" The Four Winds Light was built on a spur of red sandstone cliff jutting out into the Gulf. On one side, across the channel, stretched the silvery sand shore of the bar. On the other extended a long, curving beach of red cliffs, rising steeply from the pebbled coves. It was a shore that knew the magic and mystery of storm and star. There is a great solitude about such a shore. The woods are never solitary. They're full of whispering, beckoning, friendly life. But the sea is a mighty soul, forever moaning of some great, unshareable sorrow, which shuts it up into itself for all eternity. We can never pierce its infinite mystery. We may only wonder, awed and spellbound, on the outer fringe of it. The woods call to us with 100 voices, but the sea has one only, a mighty voice that drowns our souls in its majestic music. The woods are human, but the sea is of the company of the archangels. Anne and Gilbert found Captain Jim sitting on a bench outside the lighthouse, putting the finishing touches to a wonderful, full-rigged toy schooner. He rose and welcomed them to his abode with the gentle, unconscious courtesy that became him so well. "This has been a pretty nice day all through, Mistress Blythe, and now, right at the last, it's brought its best. Would you like to sit down here outside a bit while the light lasts? I've just finished this bit of a plaything for my little grandnephew Joe up at the Glen. After I promised to make it for him I was kind of sorry, for his mother was vexed. She's afraid he'll be wanting to go to sea later on, and she doesn't want the notion encouraged in him. But what could I do, Mistress Blythe? I'd promised him, and I think it's sort of real dastardly to break a promise you make to a child. Come, sit down. It won't take long to stay an hour." The wind was offshore and only broke the sea's surface into long, silvery ripples and sent sheeny shadows flying out across it from every point and headland like transparent wings. The dusk was hanging a curtain of violet gloom over the sand dunes and the headlands where gulls were huddling. The sky was faintly filmed over with scarves of silken vapor. Cloud fleets rode at anchor along the horizons. An evening star was watching over the bar. "Isn't that a view worth looking at?" said Captain Jim with a loving, proprietary pride. "Nice and far from the marketplace, ain't it? No buying and selling and getting gain. You don't have to pay anything. All that sea and sky free, without money and without price. There's going to be a moonrise pretty soon, too. I'm never tired of finding out what a moonrise can be over them rocks and sea and harbor. There's a surprise in it every time." They had their moonrise and watched its marvel and magic in a silence that asked nothing of the world or each other. Then they went up into the tower, and Captain Jim showed and explained the mechanism of the great light. Finally they found themselves in the dining room, where a fire of driftwood was weaving flames of wavering, elusive, sea-born hues in the open fireplace. "I put this fireplace in myself," remarked Captain Jim. "The government don't give lighthouse keepers such luxuries. Look at the colors that wood makes. If you'd like some driftwood for your fire, Mistress Blythe, I'll bring you up a load some day. Sit down. I'm going to make you a cup of tea." Captain Jim placed a chair for Anne, having first removed therefrom a huge orange-colored cat and a newspaper. "Get down, matey. The sofa is your place. I must put this paper away safe till I can find time to finish the story in it. It's called A Mad Love. 'Tisn't my favorite brand of fiction, but I'm reading it just to see how long she can spin it out. It's at the 62nd chapter now, and the wedding ain't any nearer than when it began, as far as I can see. When little Joe comes I have to read him pirate yarns. Ain't it strange how innocent little creatures like children like the bloodthirstiest stories?" "Like my lad Davy at home," said Anne. "He wants tales that reek with gore." Captain Jim's tea proved to be nectar. He was pleased as a child with Anne's compliments, but he affected a fine indifference. "The secret is I don't skimp the cream," he remarked airily. Captain Jim had never heard of Oliver Wendell Holmes, but he evidently agreed with that writer's dictum that Big Heart never liked Little Cream Pot. "We met an odd-looking personage coming out of your lane," said Gilbert as they sipped. "Who was he?" Captain Jim grinned. "That's Marshall Elliott. A mighty fine man, with just one streak of foolishness in him. I suppose you wondered what his object was in turning himself into a sort of dime museum freak." "Is he a modern Nazarite or a Hebrew prophet left over from olden times?" asked Anne. "Neither of them. It's politics that's at the bottom of his freak. All those Elliots and Crawfords and McAllisters are dyed-in-the-wool politicians. They're born Grit or Tory, as the case may be, and they live Grit or Tory, and they die Grit or Tory, and what they're going to do in heaven, where there's probably no politics, is more than I can fathom. This Marshall Elliott was a born Grit. I'm a Grit myself in moderation, but there's no moderation about Marshall. 15 years ago there was a specially bitter general election. Marshall fought for his party tooth and nail. He was dead sure the Liberals would win. So sure he got up at a public meeting and vowed that he wouldn't shave his face or cut his hair until the Grits were in power. Well, they didn't go in, and they've never got in yet, and you saw the result today for yourselves. Marshall stuck to his word." "What does his wife think of it?" asked Anne. "He's a bachelor. But if he had a wife, I reckon she couldn't make him break that vow. That family of Elliots has always been more stubborn than natural. Marshall's brother Alexander had a dog he set great store by, and when it died, the man actually wanted to have it buried in the graveyard, along with the other Christians, he said. Course he wasn't allowed to, so he buried it just outside the graveyard fence, and never darkened the church door again. But Sundays he'd drive his family to church and sit by that dog's grave and read his Bible all the time the service was going on. They say when he was dying he asked his wife to bury him beside the dog. She was a meek little soul, but she fired up at that. She said she wasn't going to be buried beside no dog, and if he'd rather have his last resting place beside the dog than beside her, just to say so. Alexander Elliott was a stubborn mule, but he was fond of his wife, so he give in and said, 'Well, durn it, bury me where you please. But when Gabriel's trump blows I expect my dog to rise with the rest of us, for he had as much soul as any derned Elliott or Crawford or McAllister that ever strutted.' Them was his parting words. As for Marshall, we're all used to him, but he must strike strangers as right down peculiar looking. I've known him ever since he was 10. He's about 50 now, and I like him. Him and me was out cod fishing today. That's about all I'm good for now, catching trout and cod occasional. But 'tweren't always so, not by no manner of means. I used to do other things, as you'd admit if you saw my life book." Anne was just going to ask what his life book was when the first mate created a diversion by springing upon Captain Jim's knee. He was a gorgeous beastie, with a face as round as a full moon, vivid green eyes, and immense white double paws. Captain Jim stroked his velvet back gently. "I never fancied cats much till I found the first mate," he remarked, to the accompaniment of the mate's tremendous purrs. "I saved his life, and when you've saved a creature's life you're bound to love it. It's next thing to giving life. There's some terrible thoughtless people in the world, Mistress Blythe. Some of them city folks who have summer homes over the harbor are so thoughtless that they're cruel. It's the worst kind of cruelty, the thoughtless kind. You can't cope with it. They keep cats there in the summer and feed 'em and pet 'em and doll 'em up with ribbons and collars, and then in the fall they go off and leave 'em to starve or freeze. It makes my blood boil, Mistress Blythe. One day last winter I found a poor old mother cat dead on the shore, lying against the skin and bone bodies of her 3 little kittens. She'd died trying to shelter 'em. She had her poor stiff paws around 'em. Master, I cried. Then I swore. Then I carried them poor little kittens home and fed 'em up and found good homes for 'em. I knew the woman who left the cat, and when she come back this summer I just went over the harbor and told her my opinion of her. It was rank meddling, but I do love meddling in a good cause." "How did she take it?" asked Gilbert. "Cried and said she didn't think. I says to her, says I, 'Do you suppose that'll be held for a good excuse in the day of judgment, when you'll have to account for that poor old mother's life? The Lord'll ask you what he gave you brains for if it wasn't to think, I reckon. I don't fancy she'll leave cats to starve another time." "Was the first mate one of the Forsaken?" asked Anne, making advances to him which were responded to graciously if condescendingly. "Yes. I found him one bitter cold day in winter, caught in the branches of a tree by his dern full ribbon collar. He was almost starving. If you could have seen his eyes, Mistress Blythe. He was nothing but a kitten, and he'd got his living somehow since he'd been left, until he got hung up. When I loosed him, he gave my hand a pitiful swipe with his little red tongue. He wasn't the able seaman you see now. He was meek as Moses. That was 9 years ago. His life has been long in the land for a cat. He's a good old pal, the first mate is." "I should have expected you to have a dog," said Gilbert. Captain Jim shook his head. "I had a dog once. I thought so much of him that when he died I couldn't bear the thought of getting another in his place. He was a friend, you understand, Mistress Blythe? Matey's only a pal. I'm fond of Matey, all the fonder on account of the spice of devilment that's in him, like there is in all cats. But I loved my dog. I always had a sneaking sympathy for Alexander Elliot about his dog. There isn't any devil in a good dog. That's why they're more lovable than cats, I reckon. But I'm darned if they're as interesting. Here I am, talking too much. Why don't you check me? When I do get a chance to talk to anyone, I run on terrible. If you've done your tea, I've a few little things you might like to look at. Picked 'em up in the queer corners I used to be poking my nose into." Captain Jim's few little things turned out to be a most interesting collection of curios, hideous, quaint, and beautiful. And almost every one of them had some striking story attached to it. Anne never forgot the delight with which she listened to those old tales that moonlit evening by that enchanted driftwood fire, while the silver sea called to them through the open window and sobbed against the rocks below them. Captain Jim never said a boastful word, but it was impossible to help seeing what a hero the man had been. Brave, true, resourceful, unselfish. He sat there in his little room and made those things live again for his hearers. By a lift of the eyebrow, a twist of the lip, a gesture, a word, he painted a whole scene or character so that they saw it as it was. Some of Captain Jim's adventures had such a marvelous edge that Anne and Gilbert secretly wondered if he were not drawing a rather long bow at their credulous expense. But in this, as they found later, they did him injustice. His tales were all literally true. Captain Jim had the gift of the born storyteller, whereby unhappy, far-off things can be brought vividly before the hearer in all their pristine poignancy. Anne and Gilbert laughed and shivered over his tales, and once Anne found herself crying. Captain Jim surveyed her tears with pleasure shining from his face. "I like to see folks cry that way," he remarked. "It's a compliment. But I can't do justice to the things I've seen or helped to do. I've 'em all jotted down in my life book, but I haven't got the knack of writing them out properly. If I could hit on just the right words and string 'em together proper on paper, I could make a great book. It would beat a mad love holler, and I believe Joe'd like it as well as the pirate yarns. Yes, I've had some adventures in my time, and you know, Mistress Blythe, I still lust after 'em. Yes, old and useless as I be, there's an awful longing sweeps over me at times to sail out there forever and ever. Like Ulysses, you would sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until you die," said Anne dreamily. "Ulysses? I've read of him. Yes, that's just how I feel. Just how all us old sailors feel, I reckon. I'll die on land after all, I suppose. Well, what is to be will be. There was an old William Ford at the Glen who never went on the water in his life 'cause he was afraid of being drowned. A fortune teller had predicted he would be, and one day he fainted and fell with his face in the barn trough and was drowned. Must you go? Well, come soon and come often. The doctor is to do the talking next time. He knows a heap of things I want to find out. I'm sort of lonesome here by times. It's been worse since Elizabeth Russell died. Her and me was such cronies." Captain Jim spoke with the pathos of the aged, who see their old friends slipping from them one by one, friends whose places can never be quite filled by those of a younger generation, even of the race that knows Joseph. Anne and Gilbert promised to come soon and often. "He's a rare old fellow, isn't he?" said Gilbert as they walked home. "Somehow I can't reconcile his simple, kindly personality with the wild, adventurous life he has lived," mused Anne. "You wouldn't find it so hard if you had seen him the other day down at the fishing village. One of the men of Peter Gautier's boat made a nasty remark about some girl along the shore.
Captain Jim fairly scorched the wretched fellow with the lightning of his eyes. He seemed a man transformed. He didn't say much, but the way he said it, you'd have thought it would strip the flesh from the fellow's bones. I understand that Captain Jim will never allow a word against any woman to be said in his presence." "I wonder why he never married," said Anne. "He should have sons with their ships at sea now, and grandchildren climbing over him to hear his stories. He's that kind of a man. Instead, he has nothing but a magnificent cat." But Anne was mistaken. Captain Jim had more than that. He had a memory. Chapter 10. Leslie Moore. "I'm going for a walk to the outside shore tonight," Anne told Gog and Magog one October evening. There was no one else to tell, for Gilbert had gone over the harbor. Anne had her little domain in the speckless order one would expect of anyone brought up by Marilla Cuthbert, and felt that she could gad shoreward with a clear conscience. Many and delightful had been her shore rambles, sometimes with Gilbert, sometimes with Captain Jim, sometimes alone with her own thoughts and new, poignantly sweet dreams that were beginning to span life with their rainbows. She loved the gentle, misty harbor shore and the silvery, wind-haunted sand shore, but best of all she loved the rock shore with its cliffs and caves and piles of surf-worn boulders, and its coves where the pebbles glittered under the pools. And it was to this shore she hied herself tonight. There had been an autumn storm of wind and rain lasting for 3 days. Thunderous had been the crash of billows on the rocks, wild the white spray and spume that blew over the bar, troubled and misty and tempest-torn the erstwhile blue peace of Four Winds Harbor. Now it was over, and the shore lay clean washed after the storm. Not a wind stirred, but there was still a fine surf on, dashing on sand and rock in a splendid white turmoil, the only restless thing in the great, pervading stillness and peace. "Oh, this is a moment worth living through weeks of storm and stress for," Anne exclaimed, delightedly sending her far gaze across the tossing waters from the top of the cliff where she stood. Presently she scrambled down the steep path to the little cove below, where she seemed shut in with rocks and sea and sky. "I'm going to dance and sing," she said. "There's no one here to see me. The seagulls won't carry tales of the matter. I may be as crazy as I like." She caught up her skirt and pirouetted along the hard strip of sand just out of reach of the waves that almost lapped her feet with their spent foam. Whirling round and round, laughing like a child, she reached the little headland that ran out to the east of the cove. Then she stopped suddenly, blushing crimson. She was not alone. There had been a witness to her dance and laughter. The girl of the golden hair and sea blue eyes was sitting on a boulder of the headland, half hidden by a jutting rock. She was looking straight at Anne with a strange expression, part wonder, part sympathy, part, could it be, envy? She was bareheaded, and her splendid hair, more than ever like Browning's gorgeous snake, was bound about her head with a crimson ribbon. She wore a dress of some dark material, very plainly made, but swathed about her waist, outlining its fine curves, was a vivid girdle of red silk. Her hands, clasped over her knee, were brown and somewhat work-hardened, but the skin of her throat and cheeks was as white as cream. A flying gleam of sunset broke through a low-lying western cloud and fell across her hair. For a moment she seemed the spirit of the sea personified, all its mystery, all its passion, all its elusive charm. You must think me crazy," stammered Anne, trying to recover her self-possession. To be seen by this stately girl in such an abandon of childishness, she, Mrs. Dr. Blythe, with all the dignity of the matron to keep up, it was too bad. "No," said the girl, "I don't." She said nothing more. Her voice was expressionless, her manner slightly repellent, but there was something in her eyes, eager yet shy, defiant yet pleading, which turned Anne from her purpose of walking away. Instead, she sat down on the boulder beside the girl. "Let's introduce ourselves," she said, with the smile that had never yet failed to win confidence and friendliness. "I'm Mrs. Blythe, and I live in that little white house up the harbor shore." "Yes, I know," said the girl. "I am Leslie Moore. Mrs. Dick Moore," she added stiffly. Anne was silent for a moment from sheer amazement. It had not occurred to her that this girl was married. There seemed nothing of the wife about her. And that she should be the neighbor whom Anne had pictured as a commonplace Four Winds housewife. Anne could not quickly adjust her mental focus to this astonishing change. Then you live in that gray house up the brook," she stammered. "Yes. I should have gone over to call on you long ago," said the other. She did not offer any explanation or excuse for not having gone. "I wish you would come," said Anne, recovering herself somewhat. "We're such near neighbors, we ought to be friends. That is the sole fault of Four Winds. There aren't quite enough neighbors. Otherwise it is perfection. You like it?" "Like it? I love it. It is the most beautiful place I ever saw." "I've never seen many places," said Leslie Moore slowly, "but I've always thought it was very lovely here. I love it too." She spoke as she looked, shyly yet eagerly. Anne had an odd impression that this strange girl, the word girl would persist, could say a good deal if she chose. "I often come to the shore," she added. "So do I," said Anne. "It's a wonder we haven't met here before." "Probably you come earlier in the evening than I do. It is generally late, almost dark when I come. And I love to come just after a storm, like this. I don't like the sea so well when it's calm and quiet. I like the struggle and the crash and the noise." "I love it in all its moods," declared Anne. "The sea at Four Winds is to me what Lover's Lane was at home. Tonight it seemed so free, so untamed. Something broke loose in me, too, out of sympathy. That was why I danced along the shore in that wild way. I didn't suppose anybody was looking, of course. If Miss Cornelia Bryant had seen me she would have foreboded a gloomy prospect for poor young Dr. Blythe." "You know Miss Cornelia?" said Leslie, laughing. She had an exquisite laugh. It bubbled up suddenly and unexpectedly with something of the delicious quality of a baby's. Anne laughed too. "Oh, yes. She's been down to my house of dreams several times." "Your house of dreams?" "Oh, that's a dear, foolish little name Gilbert and I have for our home. We just call it that between ourselves. It slipped out before I thought." "So Miss Russell's little white house is your house of dreams," said Leslie wonderingly. "I had a house of dreams once, but it was a palace," she added with a laugh, the sweetness of which was marred by a little note of derision. "Oh, I once dreamed of a palace, too," said Anne. "I suppose all girls do. And then we settle down contentedly in 8-room houses that seem to fulfill all the desires of our hearts because our prince is there. You should have had your palace, really, though. You're so beautiful. You must let me say it. It has to be said. I'm nearly bursting with admiration. You are the loveliest thing I ever saw, Mrs. Moore." "If we are to be friends you must call me Leslie," said the other with an odd passion. "Of course I will. And my friends call me Anne." "I suppose I am beautiful," Leslie went on, looking stormily out to sea. "I hate my beauty. I wish I had always been as brown and plain as the brownest and plainest girl at the fishing village over there. Well, what do you think of Miss Cornelia?" The abrupt change of subject shut the door on any further confidences. "Miss Cornelia is a darling, isn't she?" said Anne. "Gilbert and I were invited to her house to a state tea last week. You've heard of groaning tables." "I seem to recall seeing the expression in the newspaper reports of weddings," said Leslie, smiling. "Well, Miss Cornelia's groaned. At least it creaked, positively. You couldn't have believed she would have cooked so much for 2 ordinary people. She had every kind of pie you could name, I think, except lemon pie. She said she had taken the prize for lemon pies at the Charlottetown exhibition 10 years ago and had never made any since for fear of losing her reputation for them." "Were you able to eat enough pie to please her?" "I wasn't. Gilbert won her heart by eating I won't tell you how much. She said she never knew a man who didn't like pie better than his Bible. Do you know, I love Miss Cornelia." "So do I," said Leslie. "She is the best friend I have in the world." Anne wondered secretly why, if this were so, Miss Cornelia had never mentioned Mrs. Dick Moore to her. Miss Cornelia had certainly talked freely about every other individual, in or near Four Winds. "Isn't that beautiful?" said Leslie, after a brief silence, pointing to the exquisite effect of a shaft of light falling through a cleft in the rock behind them, across a dark green pool at its base. "If I had come here and seen nothing but just that, I would go home satisfied." "The effects of light and shadow all along these shores are wonderful," agreed Anne. "My little sewing room looks out on the harbor, and I sit at its window and feast my eyes. The colors and shadows are never the same 2 minutes together." "And you're never lonely?" asked Leslie abruptly. "Never, when you were alone?" "No. I don't think I've ever been really lonely in my life," answered Anne.
Even when I'm alone, I have real good company, dreams and imaginations and pretendings. I like to be alone now and then, just to think over things and taste them. But I love friendship and nice, jolly little times with people. Oh, won't you come see me often? Please do. I believe," Anne added, laughing, "that you'd like me if you knew me." "I wonder if you would like me," said Leslie seriously. She was not fishing for a compliment. She looked out across the waves that were beginning to be garlanded with blossoms of moonlit foam, and her eyes filled with shadows. "I'm sure I would," said Anne. "And please don't think I'm utterly irresponsible because you saw me dancing on the shore at sunset. No doubt I shall be dignified after a time. You see, I haven't been married very long. I feel like a girl, and sometimes like a child yet." "I have been married 12 years," said Leslie. Here was another unbelievable thing. "Why, you can't be as old as I am," exclaimed Anne. "You must have been a child when you were married." "I was 16, said Leslie, rising and picking up the cap and jacket lying beside her. "I am 28 now. Well, I must go back." "So must I. Gilbert will probably be home. But I'm so glad we both came to the shore tonight and met each other." Leslie said nothing, and Anne was a little chilled. She had offered friendship frankly, but it had not been accepted very graciously, if it had not been absolutely repelled. In silence they climbed the cliffs and walked across a pasture field of which the feathery, bleached wild grasses were like a carpet of creamy velvet in the moonlight. When they reached the shore lane, Leslie turned. "I go this way, Mrs. Blythe. You will come over and see me sometime, won't you?" Anne felt as if the invitation had been thrown at her. She got the impression that Leslie Moore gave it reluctantly. "I will come if you really want me to," she said a little coldly. "Oh, I do," exclaimed Leslie, with an eagerness which seemed to burst forth and beat down some restraint that had been imposed on it. "Then I'll come. Good night, Leslie." "Good night, Mrs. Blythe." Anne walked home in a brown study and poured out her tale to Gilbert. "So Mrs. Dick Moore isn't one of the race that knows Joseph?" said Gilbert teasingly. "No, not exactly. And yet I think she was one of them once, but has gone or got into exile," said Anne musingly. "She is certainly very different from the other women about here. You can't talk about eggs and butter to her. To think I've been imagining her a second Mrs. Rachel Lynde. Have you ever seen Dick Moore, Gilbert?" "No. I've seen several men working about the fields of the farm, but I don't know which was Moore." "She never mentioned him. I know she isn't happy." "From what you tell me, I suppose she was married before she was old enough to know her own mind or heart, and found out too late that she had made a mistake. It's a common tragedy enough, Anne. A fine woman would have made the best of it. Mrs. Moore has evidently let it make her bitter and resentful." "Don't let us judge her till we know," pleaded Anne. "I don't believe her case is so ordinary. You will understand her fascination when you meet her, Gilbert. It is a thing quite apart from her beauty. I feel that she possesses a rich nature into which a friend might enter as into a kingdom, but for some reason she bars everyone out and shuts all her possibilities up in herself so that they cannot develop and blossom. There, I've been struggling to define her to myself ever since I left her, and that is the nearest I can get to it. I'm going to ask Miss Cornelia about her."